My name is Mary Daly, and I have a chair in sociology and social policy in the department and at the university, and I'll be chairing this session. So our seminar series has run throughout the Oxford term, which means that we're in week 6 now. And our overall topic is a new dawn for social policy ? And we've had various kind of social policy considerations. Last week, for example, we had basic income. We've also heard about health policy reform, about fair work. And today we thought it really important to talk about Brexit. We need to turn back the focus on Brexit. It's been much less considered in light of the kind of focus on the on COVID. But Brexit is arguably as important, if not more important, than COVID for UK social policy. So can I introduce our speaker, who is Professor Kitty Stewart, and Kitty is an associate professor at the London School of Economics. She is also associate director of the very famous CASE Centre, which stands for the Centre for the Analysis of Social Policy and Social Exclusion. And she's deputy head of the Department of Social Policy as well. And Kitty has spent most of her working career thus far at the LSE, but previously, before she joined the LSE, she worked for another very famous and very important centre, the UNICEF Innocenti Research Centre in Florence, which works particularly on the well-being of children. Kitty is published widely on policy in its own right in the UK, but also with a broader European comparative orientation. Most people will know Kitty's work, which she's done with other colleagues at the LSE in tracking social policy developments under different governments in the UK for the last 20 years. Indeed, there was a big event at the LSE just this week on Monday launching some of that work with a particular focus on the conservative governments, various conservative governments' policies. But Kitty's specialist, she has a number of specialist interests on which she's done quite a lot of research and published widely. And I think there are probably 5 fields of work from Kitty that I know best. One is on child poverty and children's outcomes more generally, a subject which is also very close to the heart of this department, as is Kitty's second specialist area, early years policies. And even Kitty's third specialist area, social security, poverty and inequality, is also a core interest in this department. Other fields on which she's worked are employment and wage progression and Brexit. And it's Brexit and social policy that we're going to hear about this evening. And Kitty is one of the leading authorities on the implications of Brexit for UK social policy. Before I hand the microphone over to Kitty, can I just say that we are recording this session, but only the lecture part of it. We will stop the recording after Kitty has finished. She will speak for between 50 and 55 minutes, after which we'll have about 30 minutes for discussion. And the discussion, just to prepare you for the discussion, we would prefer people use the raised hand function if possible, please. And depending on which version of Zoom you have, that is either in the old Zoom under the participants banner or heading, or it's now in the new Zoom under the reactions button. So you'll find it either way. There's also a chat, but the chat is more to communicate with the organizers, who are myself, Lani from the Division of Social Science Division, Marek Nazik from this department, and also Rosella Zikia from this department. So we all can monitor the chat. So I'll hand it over to you, Kitty. You're very welcome. We're delighted to have this session, and thank you for taking us up on our invitation.
Thank you very much, Mary, and thank you for the invitation. Now, first hurdle is to share my screen. So here we are. So this is a paper about Brexit and social policy. It's co-authored with colleagues from LSE, Kerris Cooper and Isabel Schutz. And it was really written as part, as Mary said, actually, of this bigger programme that we have that launched on Monday, Social Policies and Distributional Outcomes in a Changing Britain, which tracked social policy and its impact on a wide range of outcomes over the period 2015 to 2020. And we've written it up as a rather long working paper, and you can read a very nice abbreviated version in the Journal of European Social Policy. Now, the aims, what we set out to do with the paper was really to kind of to take a broad approach to thinking about what the evidence tells us about what Brexit might mean for social policy. Broadly understood. So as under social policy there, we're thinking of living standards and poverty and inequality. We're thinking of social and employment rights and social protection, and of the provision and accessibility of public services. So it was it was a mapping of existing evidence and research, and I would say it's broad and not deep. So there's lots of areas here on which I'm certainly not an expert, and I hope so. In discussion, there may well be things that you want to add, and I hope to learn as well from the session. We wrote this paper originally in 2018, 2019, of course, against a backdrop of huge uncertainty. And I've revisited it for this presentation, just updating it a bit in terms of what we already know about the way that things are progressing. I also wanted to say that in doing the paper, we wanted to look for the opportunities and the positives as well as the challenges of Brexit. And maybe this is a point to say something about my own positionality here, which is that I voted Remain, and I was devastated by the referendum results. I did my PhD in Florence at the European University Institute. My husband is Portuguese and my children are dual nationals. And I felt feel very emotionally attached to EU membership. So part of me coming to do this paper was a sort of almost a way of dealing with this, with my reaction to Brexit, because I thought, well, there's got to be two sides to this story. There always is. And surely there are some positives here as well. So we were very much kind of on the lookout, not just to be Ramonas and point to all the challenges, but also to try to find the positives. And you can judge how effectively you think you've done this. And if we've missed any, that's great. I'd be pleased to hear them. The paper itself looks at the political and economic consequences of the referendum results, as well as of Brexit itself, because the referendum result, of course, had its own fallout in terms of a change of government, and that itself had social policy implications. But I'm not going to talk about that today. I'm going to focus on Brexit itself. So this is an overview of what I'll cover. I'm going to start by thinking about the economic consequences of Brexit and their broad implications for social policy, because that sort of underlies a lot of the other effects. And then I'm going to go on and I'm going to use this idea of taking back control, the slogan of the Vote Leave campaign, which was picked up by Theresa May and by Johnson, of course, as well, taking back control of our money, our borders and our laws. So I'm using that as an organising framework to think about the ways in which Brexit may affect social policy. And then at the end, there'll be some conclusions. And looking forward, I should have said new dawn question mark we can discuss. Okay, so where are we today? Well, we do have a sort of skeleton of our future trading relationship. Now, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement was finally agreed, I think, on Christmas Eve of 2020. And it gives us a much harder Brexit than many of us may have wanted or expected. Certainly much harder than the Norway model and much harder than the Chequers agreement, which Theresa May had set out. So a little bit better. It's better than no deal, but it is very much quite a distant relationship with the EU. So you can see there, we're not in the customs union, not in the single market for goods or services, no free movement of people. We have agreed no tariffs or quotas with the EU on any goods, including all agricultural goods. So that is pretty good as free trade arrangements go, and is better than Canada has, and it's even better than Norway has. But we have agreed very little in terms of that will reduce the non-tariff barriers to trade. And economists agree that it's the non-tariff barriers that really present the larger risks for the economy and the negative impact for the economy. So the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, no tariffs or quotas, as I said. Non-tariff barriers, briefly to summarise them, we're not in the customs union, and that means a lot of extra paperwork to show the origin of all the bits that go into the different goods that we're importing into the EU. And that means paperwork in advance, and it means checks on paperwork at borders, and it's partly what causes the queues of lorries. We also have to do a whole lot of declarations on the safety and the security of our goods. And that also requires paperwork in advance, paperwork and checks, particularly on animal origin and plants at borders. So border barriers at the borders, and barriers also in terms of additional costs for companies. The other thing really to highlight is that there's not much in this agreement to preserve access for services, and services are really important to the UK economy. Something like 80% of our economy and 50% of our exports to the EU are services. Talks are ongoing, so we may expect some improvements for the financial sector and for legal services, but broadly where things stand at the moment, levels of access, both for financial services, legal services, and a whole range of other services, are much lower levels of access than we'd like. Just things like not automatically recognising the qualifications of UK qualifications means just an extra barrier and an extra difficulty for people wanting to use services in the UK rather than in the EU. In the last few weeks, since the 1st of January, we've really started to see what this actually means in terms of real people's stories. So I'm sure you will have seen in the news pictures of, for example, the fisherman whose fish has ended up rotting because their queues were 2-3 days at borders. And queues at borders also affect other businesses, not just ones that have goods which can rot. And we've also seen stories about the additional charges that small businesses face. This is a London-based fencing equipment specialist, very highly specialised producer of fencing equipment, and he points out the additional charges is adding up to about £30 per package that he's exporting out to customers in the EU, just making his products far less competitive overnight than they were before. And this seems to is likely to lead to, one thing it may lead to is companies sort of setting up a warehouse in the EU so that they can kind of shift stuff over all at once, with job implications in itself. In terms of financial services, the expectation is the sort of shift away out of London really towards Amsterdam, Paris, Frankfurt will take place slowly over the next few years as banks and investment services make decisions about, they don't pull out immediately. We'll see this happening over time. But we did see a very dramatic shift just simply overnight in terms of where share trading is taking place. You can see pretty much overnight, huge shift away out of London and into Amsterdam, which is shaping up to be the new kind of financial trading centre for the EU. So those are kind of examples of this happening in real, this really playing out now. It's no longer theoretical. And the current projections are very much in line with the projections economists have been making since the referendum. The OBR's latest figure is that GDP is now 2% smaller than it would have been if the referendum had gone the other way. And looking ahead, they're saying a medium-term effect on our economy of 5 to 8% of GDP, which is very much in line with many of the estimates. Of course, we've had the COVID impact, which in some ways puts that into the shades, but we hope the COVID impact will be relatively short-term. And this is a sort of long-term shift in the economy. Now, what does this mean for social policy? Well, three types of effects, I think, for social policy. One is on living standards. One are the distributional effects, as some regions, some sectors will be affected more than others. And thirdly, the impact on public finances and what that means for public spending. So first of all, let's think about living standards. The estimates for again, from the OBR, the Office for Budget Responsibility, estimates that fall in growth equates to around £870 per household per year. And there's a very similar impact to date from the inflationary impacts, which have also hit living standards. So the result of currency depreciation after the referendum has led to higher prices for things that we are importing. And that's showed very clearly in this little figure here. You can see the inflation as it has affected UK goods, imported goods to the UK, and much higher than any other UK goods which don't import a high share of production. And that's had already cost average households £870 per year. I don't think that's a typo. I think that really is just the same amount. Inflation can fall very differently across parts of the distribution. And Breinlich et al., who've done this analysis, suggest that there's not actually, that it falls pretty evenly across different parts of the distribution for various reasons because of the type of goods that have been affected. But we can expect that this has had a worse impact on those in receipt of working age cash benefits, simply because we have had a political decision to freeze those benefits from 2015 to 2020. Looking for pluses, the Bank of England had projected a big drop in house prices, which could have a kind of offsetting effect in terms of people's living standards if house prices drop by a lot. The level of fall that they projected doesn't seem to have played out. And in fact, house prices were up by 14% since the referendum, though that's not true in very central parts of London. There has been some reductions in rents, and I'm going to come back to that a little bit later. Now, we can expect so that we're going to be poorer overall, but of course the effects are not going to be felt evenly by everybody in the economy by any means. And there are various ways of thinking about the distributional effect. One is to look at how these will affect different regions. There's a reasonable amount of consensus that areas that trade more, that have a higher share of trade with the EU in their local economies, will be worse affected. And that ought to mean that London and the South East are relatively protected. They tend to trade more globally, even though services are important, financial services are important in London's economy. And areas such as the Northwest, the Midlands, will be hardest hit, Northern Ireland. These areas are areas that are poorer to start with, so this is kind of deepening the levels of regional inequality. Not everybody agrees with this, so there are some projections that actually London and the South East are likely to be very exposed because of our greater trade in services. Also, the South East has the advantage of geographical proximity to the European Union, so other parts, other ports, other areas may benefit from dispersion of trade. And we have seen a bit more trade going around into other ports as there have been queues, for example, at Dover, recently. However, Dinger et al., who've done this analysis, also do point out that even a shock which is actually smaller in size may have a bigger effect and be felt more keenly in a poorer part of the country. And it's also the case that London and the Southeast are a bit more resilient in terms of perhaps being able to diversify into other areas more quickly. London and the Southeast were hardest hit by the recession, by the big financial crisis in 2007, but they bounced back much more quickly than some other parts of the country. We can also think of distributional effects in terms of which sectors and groups of workers will be affected. And the sectors with the greatest exposure to EU trade include clothing and textiles, transport, including car manufacturing, chemicals and pharmaceuticals, and finance. And Level and Keeler of the IFS have looked at this data and at the types of people who work there. They conclude that men are more exposed than women, and that lower educated men are most exposed of all. And interestingly, what they point to is the fact that these are, what's at risk here are good jobs for people who are skilled manual labour, who don't have other qualifications, which would make it easy for them to switch into other skilled work, and who are relatively high paid, middle to higher income, and certainly high paid for their education group. And so the implications of that are actually that inequality could fall, including gender inequality. So if the men with the well-paid jobs lose those jobs and are maybe having to shift into much lower paid work or no work at all, that could have some positive implications in terms of inequality. It's kind of leveling down effects. But obviously this is worrying in terms of the risk for men working in those sectors, and sort of echoes what we've seen in the past in terms of deindustrialization, closures of mines and so on. One might think, well, at least, so there may be these negative effects facing these workers in terms of jobs available, but on the other hand, there must be less competition, because if migrants are less likely to be coming in, there might be a sort of counterbalancing effect. And in fact, the evidence suggests that we can't be optimistic about that at all. So research on the impact of, that's looked at the impact of EU migration since we opened up in 2004 show that there really don't seem to be any negative effects on employment. It's almost the case that one extra migrant coming in creates an extra job. Because they then use services, they buy things and so on. And so the counter of that is that we wouldn't expect to see increases in jobs available as migrants withdraw. There may be very small effects on wages for low-skilled workers, so less competition from low-skilled migrants could mean positive effects on wages, but these are really tiny in the estimates, and in fact have been already wiped out by the effects of inflation since 2016. So once again, on the hunt for positives. And as someone who's always sort of thought, is it a good thing that our economy is so dominated by financial services and by the City of London, and that has a series of negative effects in terms of pushing up house prices in London, the kind of very ostentatious inequalities that we have in the city. And also, there's an argument that it leads to it pushes our currency up. I mean, and that makes goods less competitive, manufacturing goods less competitive. So could we say that, a reduction in the size of London could end up having positive effects that offset some of the problems for trade? We have to remember that's going to bring with it a loss of lots of supporting jobs. And we've seen this risk for manufacturing. So there's a question there about how far rebalancing can go. We might conclude that we will be poorer, but more equal possibly overall, but certainly the evidence pointing towards us being poorer seems much more certain than evidence which supports it. The evidence on whether we will be more equal or not remains, I think, much less certain. The final consequence of a smaller economy is that we have less tax revenue. So the Treasury projected increased borrowing because of Brexit of between £20 billion and £80 billion, depending on what scenario we ended up with, and we're closer to no deal, I think, than to the Norway model. Again, these numbers really fade into insignificance compared to what we're spending currently on COVID. But that doesn't reduce the problem, in the sense it kind of compounds the problem that we are going to be facing this smaller economy while we're also, we've also increased borrowing a lot because of COVID. And a smaller economy, a reduction in tax revenue runs through and affects, has implications for many of the other social policy consequences of Brexit. Some of which, I think, if we had lots of money and we were prepared to spend it, we could address in ways which might end up being quite positive. So let's go on and think about taking back control and what this means. Taking back control being quite possibly the most effective slogan in history, potentially. And we're going to look at taking back control of our, well, let's start by looking at taking back control of our money, which we've almost sort of answered already. So one of the arguments for taking back control is that we give a lot of money to the EU. This bus, which gives a very false sum, will be familiar to any of you who were here at the time of the referendum. The argument that we give the EU a lot of money in dues, in sort of membership payments. And the net contribution was about £8 billion a year. So if we can get all this money back, we can give it to the NHS. That doesn't equate to 350 million, it equates to a lot less. But still, in principle, if that was the case, that we're going to get this net £8 billion, we would have more money to spend. In fact, first of all, the divorce bill that we agreed with the EU as part of the withdrawal settlement was 39 billion. So that rules out savings until 2023. After that, we have this 8 billion that we're no longer sending to the EU. But a reduction in GDP of 1% is a bit more than 8 billion in tax revenue. So, and we've just seen that we're expecting a fall in GDP of more like 5 to 8%. So this net contribution is actually a fraction, maybe 15, maybe 20% max of what we can expect to lose as a result of a weakened trade relationship. So there's no sort of Brexit dividend. So taking back control of money is a slogan, but it doesn't correspond to any money. Actually, it's the opposite. We're going to, I guess, take back control of having less money, debt. What about taking back control of our borders? Again, this was a really important part of the kind of rhetoric in the referendum that people like this idea. What does it mean in practice? Well, of course, one thing that it means, which is we could think of as a social policy implication in the sense that this affects all of us, the quality of our lives. UK citizens have lost the right to live and study and work in 27 EU member states. And new EE migrants, we now have had this confirmed, will be subject to the exact same immigration controls as non-EEA migrants. And what we've got is a points-based system, and essentially this will allow in skilled workers who can speak English, who have at least A levels, who work for approved employers and have a job offer at least £25,600, a bit less if you're a young worker, you're coming into a shortage occupation, or you hold a STEM PhD or a postdoc. And there's some also, you can come in if you are on a list of highly skilled scientists and researchers. You can come in without a job offer, you're particularly sought after, and you can come in if you've got a lot of money and are prepared to invest and create some jobs. So what does this mean? Well, on the one hand, there are implications here clearly for people who fall into this category now. So for new EEA migrants, there are obvious implications for their social rights. They now, like non-EEA migrants, they will face annual health charges to access the NHS. They will be subject to a condition of no recourse to public funds for the first 5 years that they're here. They will be able to access contributory benefits when they have made contributions, but they won't have access to means tested or universal benefits such as child benefit, semi-universal. There are also risks to EEA migrants who are already here, who have arrived before the 31st of December 2020, can apply for settled status, and that actually would give them probably better access to social rights and provisions than they might otherwise have been entitled to, given the way things were moving and kind of tightening up of access to certain rights. But there's a risk here, I think, about making sure that everybody does this. There's a cut-off, a time point after which people won't be able to do this anymore. And we've seen the effects of the Windrush scandal, where people lived here for decades before being told that they hadn't filled in the right paperwork 30 years ago and had rights removed. So I think that's something we need to be alert to looking ahead. It's likely to be more vulnerable people who maybe don't go through that. And there may be children also who won't do it, because it should be their parents that do it for them. What I want to focus on, though, more here is the implications of the end to free movement for everybody else in the UK, and what we are gaining or losing from telling a lot of people, discouraging a lot of people in the European Union from moving here. And here you can see that there have been very large effects already on the numbers of EU citizens coming to the UK. Just as soon as the referendum took place, we see a big drop in immigration from the European Union for work reasons. So what will this mean? And there are kind of two possible things here that might to weigh against each other. On the one hand, it could mean reductions in pressure on our public services. On the other hand, it could mean an impact on the delivery of our public services, because some of these workers are working in services, in health, in social care, and so on. So I'm just going to look at three areas briefly: tax benefits, health and social care, and social housing. So benefits, first of all, and again, I think this has been a really important part of the rhetoric that is behind the referendum result itself. Here's one article by Priti Patel, who's now Home Office Minister, writing in the Express back in 2013. And this is just, if you look through these newspapers, this is just one of dozens and dozens, hundreds of articles putting forward this picture. We can't afford benefit tourists, a destructive failure of the last Labour government. It let all these people in from Eastern Europe, and implication that they're benefit tourists, and implication completely without justification that these people in this picture are benefit tourists. So no free movement means we can finally stop these benefit tourists from coming, and surely that will have good effects on our fiscal position. Well, of course, in fact, this whole thing about benefit tourism was pretty invented. So first of all, EU citizens could only ever come if they were workers or self-employed or looking for work. You couldn't just show up and claim benefits. And actually the weight of evidence, and I'll show you some in a minute, suggests that EEA migrants, including the East European migrants, the A8 group who came after 2004, pay more in taxes than UK-born residents, and they pay more than they receive in benefits or social provision. And that's partly because migrants tend to be younger and more likely to be in work than the UK population. And therefore, a reduction in migration is unlikely to have positive effects and may well have negative effects on public finances. So let's look at a little bit of evidence. Now, these estimates, it's quite difficult to do this, particularly in relation to public services, because we don't really keep data on public service use, use of health services by immigration status. So these calculations involve a fair bit of assumptions, but they give you a fairly consistent picture. UK government data looks at just at the tax benefits, which is much easier to do, what people pay in, what they receive in benefits. And they show that EEA migrants make a net fiscal contribution, although there is variation by country. It suddenly occurred to me that maybe I should have explained what EEA is. So that's the European Economic Area, which includes the European Union countries and a few other additional countries such as Norway, Iceland, and so on. So that's what we're talking about when I say EEA migrants. They're migrants from the European Economic Area. Sorry about that. So EEA migrants on average pay more than UK-born adults. When we include services, as I say, it gets a bit more complicated, but again, we get a positive story. So Dustman and Frattini is a very well-known paper, which estimates that across that decade, 2001 to 2011, they look at EU immigrants specifically, and they say they made a net contribution of £15 billion over that decade. Meanwhile, the UK-born residents cost almost 617 billion. That's, remember, a time where there was a big financial crisis and recession, but the EU migrants were making a little bit of, doing a bit to help the overall fiscal position. And Dustman and Frattini have faced various challenges over the assumptions that they make there in terms of how they share out certain services. I think they don't charge, so to speak, the EU immigrants anything for certain public goods, which is perhaps not right. So Rawthorne kind of addresses some of those. But Rawthorne also concludes that either there's a modest fiscal surplus here, or at least migrants paid their way when we look at the overall picture. Now, these are all kind of static in the sense that they just look at what's happening while the migrants are here, and a better estimate would take a kind of life course approach. There have been attempts to do this, and we'd expect that taking a life course approach would give a more favourable picture for the migrants, partly because they bring with them a whole lot of human capital that their home country has invested in. They've been to school and been trained somewhere else. And then partly because they often will go home in retirement. So again, lower costs. So the Migration Advisory Committee do a dynamic model where they try to take account of this, and they estimate a net contribution over a lifetime of £78,000 for migrants. So, in conclusion, not having all these migrants from the EEA, one would expect would have a negative effect, if anything, and it points towards a negative effect on our fiscal position, not a positive effect. That may be true overall, and yet there still be particular pressures on particular services. So I want to look just at health and social care, and then at housing in terms of the evidence here, and I'll try to be brief on this. So when we look at EU immigrants' use of healthcare, we find they're less likely to have hospital admissions than the general population. Except maternity benefits, they're more likely to have children than the general population. And having more migrants in a local area reduces waiting times, has no effect on GP satisfaction. On the other hand, there is some evidence, and this is really sort of not scraping the barrel, but really looking for evidence that there may be negative effects. So the waiting times effect is largest in the least deprived areas, and a short-run negative effect in some of the more deprived areas was identified following the 2004 EU enlargement. So it is possible that in some deprived areas, in which particularly in a context in which we have seen we've seen spending on healthcare not keep up with needs, having more migrants in your area may be felt at least to be having a negative effect on your experience and helping to increasing your likelihood of waiting. So you can sort of understand why people might think that, even though the evidence is really not strong. On the other hand, what we do know is that EU migrants are making a big contribution in terms of delivering healthcare. So we know that there's lots of roles unfulfilled in healthcare and in social care, and that EU workers make up quite a large share of both the NHS and the social care workforce. So 10% of doctors in NHS England, and much higher in some specialisms, and 7% of the total workforce in social care are EU nationals, 13% in London. So big shortage. We've already got shortages, and these shortages are expected to increase as a result of having lower migration from the EEA. What are the answers here? Well, one is to have an easier immigration route for shortage staff, and we are doing that. So medical practitioners and nurses are on the shortage occupation list. Of course, they may just not want to come anymore. It's all very well. So in some senses, this is like taking back control. We don't let anyone in, but we kind of let in the people that we really need. But it may not be as easy to do that as we would like, given that by creating an atmosphere where we make it more uncertain and less welcoming, we put people off coming. The other thing we can do is train our own workers, and I'll come back to that right at the end. That seems certainly a sensible thing to be doing, to invest more in training nurses and doctors in the UK, and improving pay and conditions in social care to make those jobs attractive to young people here. Of course, those things both cost money, so the constraints on money are an issue here. Now, I need to speed up, so I'm just going to say that for social housing, the picture is sort of quite similar, in the sense that there's evidence of people of white Britons feeling that they are discriminated against in relation to other ethnic groups, certainly. And in fact, there's no evidence actually that migrants are given priority, but some groups of migrants may have characteristics that confer priority for social housing, such as having larger families. So that could feed misperceptions. And as with health, I think the really important thing here is, again, if spending on this has not been keeping up, and that's very true for housing, there has not been investment in the supply of housing. So that means there are very long waiting lists. And some of the housing is going to EEA migrants, and there has been an increase, a slight increase over time in the share going to EEA migrants. So that clearly does have some impact on UK-born tenants will have to wait for longer. But the real issue here is the lack of supply, rather than the EEA migrants themselves. And again, as for health, we have an issue here, which is a lot of the workforce come from these countries. 50% of the building workforce in London comes from an EEA country. That's big. So again, solution, well, maybe we need to be training our own young people better to do these jobs and fill the gaps. There have been evidence in terms of private rents. There I was talking about social housing, which tends to be better quality and lower cost than private housing, and therefore is very sought after. There have been implications in terms of reductions in private rents as the number of EU nationals have left the country. So in some ways that must have had a positive effect for some groups. There are interesting and complex implications of that for long-term affordability. So housing associations, which try to provide affordable housing with a mix of private rents and social rents, have actually been really hit by that because they're no longer able, they no longer have as many people paying the kind of higher private rents, and that has knock-on effects on their ability to provide to absorb rent arrears, for example, and to invest in new builds. So there's a kind of complex market that we have here, and I think simply relying on fewer people is not a solution. So we need to think much more broadly in terms of how to address these housing problems, in terms of increased public investment in affordable housing and possibly looking at things like rent controls. Okay, moving on to taking back controls of our, the problem here is something keeps getting in the way of what I can see, taking back control of our laws. And I'm going to talk briefly about two ways in which we're taking back control of our laws. And the first one is in terms of social and employment rights. Now here we have another quote from a tabloid newspaper with Boris Johnson here making up a complete invented figure that 60% of the laws going through Westminster are generated in the EU. So this idea of taking back our laws is really going to give sovereignty back to the UK. And this is hugely exaggerated and very hard to see where he gets that figure from. But there are ways with particular relevance for areas of social policy in which Brexit will allow the UK to withdraw from certain aspects of European legislation. And there are implications there for workers' rights and for citizens' rights. So after Brexit, now we are no longer subject to the Charter of Fundamental Rights, which brings together all the civil and political, social and economic rights gained at different times and is enforced by the Court of Justice of the European Union. So we are out of that, and the government has been very clear that they refuse to continue to be subject to the CJEU. Now there is still important rights legislation in Britain. We've got the Equalities Acts, but those were passed by our government, but they're not constitutionally protected. So those things could be unpicked and undone. We are still part of the European Convention on Human Rights, which is enforced by the European Court of Human Rights, but that focuses on civil and political rights rather than social and economic rights. And we're also part of the European Social Charter, enforced by the Council of Europe, which does have social rights in it, but there's absolutely no enforcement, no judicial enforcement there. So the concerns looking forwards are firstly about gaps in rights legislation. So there are certain things, the freestanding right to non-discrimination, the rights of the child, the right to dignity, that are not covered and protected once we are out of the Charter. There are also weaker remedial mechanisms, so much harder for people if they feel their right is not being upheld, they have fewer places to go. It's harder for them to get justice. There's also a risk of kind of being left behind as the EU law continues to progress, and a potential erosion of existing rights, particularly employment rights. And UK history on this is not very encouraging. It's certainly, I mean, there are some ways in which we've led, certainly in terms of disability discrimination, discrimination on race as well. But there are other ways, particularly things that affect more vulnerable workers. So things like the Working Time Directive, support for protections for part-time workers, for agency workers, for precarious workers. Those have all been kind of enforced on us against our will by the European Union. And there may well be pressure to sort of relax some of those regulations, not least because we want to attract investment to a Britain that is less attractive now that we are outside the European Union. So the kind of risk that we go for being a low regulation kind of economy to attract people in. Now, sure enough, this is January 2021, and the government confirms that they are doing a review of UK employment law. And it seems as though the sorts of things that are under consideration here are kind of things that may seem relatively minor, rules around rest breaks, including overtime and calculating holiday entitlements. Also scrapping the 48-hour working week is under discussion. But these are the kind of bits of legislation that really provide additional protections for some workers who are otherwise very vulnerable. This is more recently, last week, Ian Duncan Smith saying, you know, of course, we're not going to just bonfire all the rules. Slash and burn of EU rules ruled out post-Brexit. And I like this story because it sounded like Downing Street was going to businesses and saying, come on, you need to give us lots of things, lots of bits of red tape and regulations that we need to burn and get rid of. And the businesses are kind of saying, actually, it's all working it's fine, it's working fine. The red tape we really don't want is the red tape at the borders with the lorries and all of that. Now, I guess there's a serious point here, which is that if there's a point about democracy. I mean, if we don't want these, what we've been doing really is relying on the European Union to protect us from ourselves in a way, and to protect us from we elect governments which aren't so protective of workers' rights. And then we've had the European Union sort of ensuring that we don't have to live with the consequences of what our elected governments would like to do. So this is democracy, you know, this is taking back control, I guess. If taking back control means we get to decide now, and what we're going to decide is we're going to elect governments that want to weaken workers' rights, then that's democracy. I guess that certainly wasn't one of the things that was put very clearly to people in the referendum, I think, that taking back control meant we want to weaken workers' rights. I didn't see that being put forward very loudly. But there is a serious question, I think, here. Okay, finally, Mary, do I just have how many minutes do I have?
You have a good 5 minutes, Kitty, if you can cover it in that, but we can go, 6 minutes.
Okay, so very briefly, I just wanted to say something about state aid and state intervention in the economy. Because this is somewhere that I looked for kind of positives in a sense. So I'll cover it very briefly. We could come back in discussion. But state aid laws there's a whole lot of EU regulations which restrict governments from intervening in the economy. And they're aimed at kind of promoting competition and making sure that one country can't really subsidize a domestic business, and so that it can outcompete a company in another member state. And they're also aimed at stopping big companies, multinationals, from going around looking for special treatment and subsidies. So they're protected. There've been rulings against Apple in Ireland, against Amazon in Luxembourg. And this is sometimes called the Lexit, the left-wing case for Brexit, is that this would prevent a really interventionist government from doing a whole lot of interventionist activity. So if we had a government that really wanted to intervene and wanted to do things like intervene to protect an industry that was at risk of going under, to protect jobs in a certain local area, these rules would get in the way. And this discussion about state aid rules actually was very much in the news at the end of last year, because it was one of the things along with fish that seemed to be the last thing to be decided. The EU wanted us to stick to the state aid rules in the interest of a level playing field. The UK did not want to. Not, I think, because they had big plans to intervene in the economy, but because they did not want to be subject to the Court of Justice of the European Union. And in the end, we've got a result which is a little bit of a halfway house, and we're going to continue to be subject to these rules with a few sort of caveats. So we won't need to get prior approval from the European Commission, as is currently the case, if we want to intervene. And there's a few more examples where we can, as with the EU rules, we will only be able to intervene to remedy a market failure, but we can also do so to address an equity rationale. And that seems to give a bit more discretion than current EU rules. And there's going to be no CJEU. But I think the point that we make in the paper, and that still remains the case, is that this story about the state aid rules seems really exaggerated. So there's lots of exemptions that EU countries can do already within the rules. And it is also the case that countries use these exemptions far more extensively than the UK currently does. So you can see, say, Germany spends 4 times what we spend in state aid. So this, you know, it seems to be has been an issue of principle that certainly for our government, that it wanted not to be subject to these rules. For a future government that wanted to do a lot more intervention, there would still be a lot that can be done within the rules. So it's not obvious that Brexit has really would change the game here, even if we were no longer subject to the rules at all. All right, finally, just 3 other brief positives that I've come across. First of all, we, on 1st of January 2021, we were able to abolish the tax on sanitary products. Again, something you might have seen very much in the news. At last, we were freed from EU VAT rules, which meant a minimum of 5% on sanitary products, and our freedom has meant we've abolished them, and that's great. Women are going to save an estimated £40 across a lifetime. So that's a good thing, but not huge, perhaps, in the general scheme of things. Similarly, people have argued that we have more room for manoeuvre with alcohol taxes. We haven't done anything about that yet, but there are some kind of small areas in which freedom can mean perhaps doing things doing things as we want to do them. Finally, I guess the big story over the last few months has been the vaccine rollout. The UK is way ahead of the vaccine rollout. This was the headline in a German newspaper yesterday. Dear Britain, we envy you. They envy us the speed of our rollouts. And I suppose this is, being one little country that's able to do things on its own has given a lot more flexibility. I think we would have been able to do that even within the EU, but it might have been politically much more difficult to say, we're just going to go our own way, we're not going to coordinate with you. What the EU has been doing is trying to coordinate across 27 different countries and make sure smaller countries aren't left behind and everybody can be as part of the vaccine rollout. But the result of that has been that they have been slow. So we can see, I guess, the EU, the EU is like a big sort of compromise in essence. And if you opt out of the big compromise, there are a few ways in which there can be gains. How we weigh those up against the losses, I guess, it doesn't really matter how we weigh them up now because we are where we are. But here's, first of all, a sort of summary. So we've taken back control of money, borders, and laws. And that seems to have meant that we're going to end up with less money, lower living standards, and a smaller fiscal envelope. The economic impacts and how they fall across different areas and groups are uncertain still, but likely to be substantial disruption falling on some industries and businesses and people disproportionately more than others. In terms of borders, we have lost our rights to live, work and travel in 27 countries. I've tried to put the positives in green, and for me, having less cultural change and fewer EU immigrants in Britain is a major negative. But I know that for some people that is a real positive. I think we need to be, honest about that. So I put that in green on behalf of people who haven't felt happy about the way things have changed, perhaps. There are new restrictions on social rights for EU migrants, and I focus more here on what lower migration means in terms of increasing challenges for delivering public services, and not much effects in terms of relieving pressures. Finally, in terms of laws, more control over social and employment rights means more democracy, really, but potentially it means worse outcomes, and those worse outcomes, I think, will fall on more vulnerable workers. We've got a bit more control over state aid, but to a limited extent. And in fact, we have never used the powers that we already had. So it's not obvious that will really make a difference. And we've got a bit more control over a few other decisions, from VAT rates to the speed and to which vaccines we want to purchase. So where do we go from here? A new dawn for Britain, ? I guess there seem to be two really important things, I think, that we need to do when you look at the risks that Brexit is throwing up. And one is a really active industrial strategy, which provides vigorous compensatory investment to regions and areas within state aid laws that will be affected by trade disruptions, and thinking about a strategy that really thinks about how we replace the high quality jobs that it looks like we may lose, and how we want to shape our economy going forward in ways that protects those areas and provides new jobs for those workers. And the second thing is a really serious strategy of investment in training and in pay to try to fill the gaps in health, in social care, in construction, and give our own young people opportunities to do those jobs, which means training, and it also means pay, because at the moment social care is not well paid, the conditions are not good, and it's not attractive to many young people. And the challenge here is obvious. It's political will, first of all, but it's also resources. And we've kind of in this bind. On the one hand, Brexit leaves us in a position where we really need to do these things. And on the other hand, it leaves us in a position where we have less money to do them. So that is the challenge, I think, that faces us. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Kitty. I mean, I appreciate so much, and I think everybody does appreciate very much the breadth of the presentation, but also the clarity and the attempt you made to be even-handed, even if it did result in very little green text in that penultimate slide. So huge thanks for us. We've stopped recording now.